All right, it is Monday, March 21st, and my guest today is Sam Fortier from the Washington Post. Sam, thanks for hopping on today.
Yeah, of course, man. Thanks as always for having me.
Absolutely. The fellas are out of town, and actually, here he is. I should have waited one extra minute. All right, Robert, how are you?
Well, if Sam's on, I'm not going to be on. So
Uh,
that's the only thing I'm going to say right as we get going here.
I thought my agent let you know that I had the same contract in my clause as well. So
I'm sorry I'm late. It unfortunately the NFL is trying to literally ruin my life. I mean, just every 10 minutes it's something where we have a podcast planned, and then of course now that no longer stands. So now it's just constant changing everything, and it's been really fun. But it's I'm going to be really ready for when the news starts to slow down here in a couple weeks.
and they told us this was the off season and that nothing happens. This one feels like the off season we've been waiting on for like a decade, right? I mean, we're constantly being told about quarterback carousels and huge free agent classes, and it seems like that never happens. Matt Ryan today on his way to the Colts. Let's start with this, Sam. These two trades will always be linked now. I mean, they'll get Matt Ryan for a third, it sounds like. Commanders gave up a third and a possible second for Wentz. I'll ask you this: did the Colts get better today? Because I feel like the Commanders definitely got better.
I think the Colts got better from presumably Jacob Eason or whomever they were going to end up starting. Like I would imagine that Matt Ryan's a significant upgrade. I think to me the question is if you're the Commanders and if Matt Ryan's available at pretty equal price for one fewer draft pick, and you get to keep a second round pick next year, considering you're probably not, a quarterback away from being the team that you want to be, would it have been smarter to pursue Matt Ryan? I know that some people would say, oh, Matt Ryan's 37, not a long-term answer. Carson Wentz is 29. But Matt Ryan has been a lot more consistent, has a much more proven track record than Carson Wentz. I think because this happened like 15 minutes ago, I'm still trying to like weigh these things out in my head, right? But I think you could make a pretty good case that Matt Ryan for a third is better value than Carson Wentz for 2/3, one possibly being a second. But if Robert Mays wants to talk me out of that, I'm more than open to it.
You're barking up the wrong tree if you want me to talk you out of it, because I'm not going to talk you out of it. I think that Matt Ryan is, and this is one of those scenarios where Sam, you can talk to their thinking much better than I can. But if you're Washington, this is one of those moments where like we just need a guy. We'll pay what we need to. I mean, when you're talking about that position, sometimes picking over the value and trying to really nitpick, all right, like do we really get value back in this conversation? It's not always the most important thing. And I assume that was what drove their thinking here. It's like, yeah, is 2 picks and $28 million of Carson Wentz a lot to pay? Sure. But we need an upgrade at that position. And even if there was a slight overpay, I'm sure that's what they're thinking. In Indianapolis, value dictates every single thing they do pretty much all of the time. So that's kind of what this feels like is, I mean, the Carson Wentz trade from last year aside, which I'm sure there are a lot of regrets in that building about what happened there. But if you look at this move and you think about just the two trades next to each other, we got to be able to trade essentially what you got, half of what you got for Carson Wentz to go get Matt Ryan and pay him this year $5 million less than you were going to pay Carson Wentz, to owe nothing to Carson Wentz, and to get a guy who, by all accounts, is a much better. If you're going to have a quarterback at the center of this entire thing, I think you'd rather have Matt Ryan with still a fairly young roster, a team that really values culture and how guys go about this. Like, and the Colts side of this, I absolutely think that they're going to believe they're in a much better spot now than they were a couple weeks ago, and it really cost them nothing when you consider what they were already paying for Carson Wentz in both resources and in salary.
The league has pivoted. Does it feel like draft picks just aren't what they used to be? I mean, it feels like for 5 or 6 years it was draft picks over everything. Maybe Rams leading the charge have just gotten rid of high value draft picks in place of players that are already successful. Is this becoming a way of less risk adversity, or is it just a one-off for the last couple of years?
If you look at it, I mean, it's kind of fascinating that teams are willing to pay anything more or less. Again, value be damned to go get a quarterback. You look at the trade for Wentz, you look at the trade for Darnold last year, and some of the returns on some of these quarterbacks, even if they're not guys you're excited about, are still pretty substantial. But then look at the trades for Amari Cooper, Khalil Mack, and Robert Woods over the last couple of weeks. Teams aren't willing to part with draft picks for guys with those sort of salary numbers. So to me, this seems like a quarterback specific thing where teams are willing to overpay to have some sort of certainty at that position, even if it's certainty in the form of Sam Darnold. I mean, it's a different way of thinking about it. It's a different way of business when it's that position in question, just because not only is having the right guy there, but having competency there is worth such a premium that I feel like it's dictating how teams are approaching some of this stuff.
And one of those caveats I would throw, like, for the value of draft picks is, and I think of this probably in Washington specific terms, although I'm sure it applies to like other dysfunctional organizations. Like, I think you have to pay a risk tax. Like, for example, if Washington, I don't think Washington could say, hey, Indianapolis, we're not going to give you that second, third round pick, cut Carson, and then we'll just sign him, because I think there's a very real chance if Indianapolis cuts Carson Wentz doesn't want to come to Washington. I think that they're in that position a lot, especially when you don't have a long-term solution for years and years and years, because just your reputation of your organization, or the status of your roster with maybe some of those draft picks you have or have not hit on. It's, hey, what do we have to pay to not compete with this guy in free agency? Because even if Washington were, hey, we're going to compete for Mitch Trubisky, then you're sacrificing, okay, if like had been rumored before free agency, he was going to get multiple years, maybe $10 million a year. And then you're locked into paying that, he has guaranteed money in year two, unlike Carson Wentz. So, I mean, it's all trade-offs, it's all cost benefit. But as Robert said, I think that the valuation of draft picks and how willing people are to get rid of them, even San Francisco trading up for Trey Lance, I think it's a quarterback-driven valuation of those picks.
I've been calling that the shitty org tax that you have to pay to get players to come. What's surprising though? I mean, there was no foresight with the Falcons though, right? I mean, I'm not sure what the plan was. They could have had a quarterback in what was considered a good quarterback draft class last year. They went tight end instead. It just seemed I'm not sure what the plan was, or if there was a plan. I'm not sure what the plan was in Indy, if there was a plan. I mean, they got rid of him, I guess, thinking, if the rumors are true, 10 days ago they started with Matt Ryan talks, but it was odd how teams just kind of made moves without a parachute here.
I think with the Indy, the idea is that whatever we got back in the Carson Wentz deal, and what they got back was 2 mid-round picks. It's kind of similar to how I was thinking about the Browns, right? If the Browns go in on Deshaun Watson, they don't get him. They know they have to move on from Baker. What they would hopefully get for Baker in a trade is something they could flip for a quarterback of similar value to Baker Mayfield. And that seems to be with the Colts with Carson Wentz. They knew whatever they got back in the Wentz trade, they could probably go get a quarterback that was going to cost them similar draft capital and take up a similar salary as Carson Wentz. Then that's exactly what happened. I mean, you look at it, it's a third round pick and $23 million for Matt Ryan. It's almost the exact same placeholder as that. And when you think you're making a parallel move and you're not going to really lose out on anything by moving on from a guy that you have no interest in having on your roster anymore, which is where the Colts were, then I don't think you're really making a huge risk. And it kind of seems like Cleveland was making a similar calculation, right? We don't mind upsetting Baker Mayfield in this entire thing, because if we do ultimately have to move on from him, right now, the way that it looks, there are almost more quarterbacks than there are seats available at the table. Like, Jimmy Garoppolo's market is not going to be robust here. So if you're Cleveland and you're saying, if we get a third or fourth for Baker and we ultimately have to flip a second for $25 million of Jimmy, you're not really doing much different. Like, those things on a chalkboard look very similar. So I think that's why these teams were willing to kind of make these moves, because they knew that even if they had to make a parallel jump, it wasn't going to put them in a bad spot.
You brought up Watson just real quick, Sam. No chance Washington was in on Watson, right? I mean, you see the responses to the Browns making that deal. Washington couldn't have taken that kind of PR hit. Too, were they into him at all?
I think that Washington, when they said that they talked to everybody, including Andrew Luck, I'd be surprised if Andrew Luck were on that list and Deshaun Watson were not, to be honest with you. I'm sure that they could do their homework and maybe if Ron Rivera goes to Dan Snyder and Dan Snyder says, hey, considering everything I have going on, that's not a move that we're willing to make. These are hypothetical, of course. I'm just saying, I'm sure they did their homework on Deshaun, and whether or not it was draft capital, whether or not it was the sexual harassment investigations, both for Dan Snyder and Deshaun Watson being the thing that strikes him from the list. I don't know, but I can imagine. I feel rather confident that they did their homework, and ultimately, he's not one of the guys that they ended up pursuing really hard.
What do we make the salary cap manipulation every year? I mean, are we to believe that the salary cap is a thing, or like I'm not really sure what the point of it is anymore?
I think the salary cap is a thing. It doesn't have to be a thing if your owner doesn't want it to be a thing, right? If you want to keep pushing money years and then all of that, you can keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. But I think for most teams, the salary cap is very real. I mean, even if you're a team that has shown a willingness to kind of stretch yourself financially and make some moves that aren't traditional. I mean, the Rams last year ate $30 million of Jared Goff because they knew they had to upgrade at that position. They've been willing to eat huge amounts of money for Brandon Cooks, for Todd Gurley in the past. But eventually, you have to face the music. I mean, when you look at the Robert Woods deal, that's driven by the fact that there's only so much money. So even if the salary cap is fungible, it is still very real. Eventually, you're going to have to make some tough decisions no matter who you are and how you go about your business.
And I think the New Orleans Saints are another good example of that, right? But also to your point, Robert, like I think it's a lot of ownership driven. I think that kind of links like the last couple points, because I would be surprised if the Colts would be as motivated to have gotten rid of Carson Wentz had Jim Irsay not reacted in the way that he has. So whether it be cap manipulation, whether it be roster, I mean, like not that I need to tell Washington fans, hey, the owner's a big deal, but we're talking, there was a lot of talk about ownership in baseball, obviously the last couple months, but I think it's the same is true in football. Like the owner, I think, drives a lot of what your franchise is willing to do per se.
The AFC West is a Pro Bowl event now. Are you surprised that Russell Wilson chose Denver in what would have been, I guess, now the hardest division in the league?
I'm not really surprised. And I think that if you look at the infrastructure there and all of the things pointing that direction, stuff like the way they handled Peyton Manning and what ended up happening there with Peyton Manning, when you talk to elite quarterbacks, it's amazing how in tune they are about what is happening with other elite quarterbacks. It's unbelievable. They know what kind of say those guys have in the building, how much control they have over the way the offense is dictated, all that stuff. And when you think about the quarterback history, the fact that John Elway is still there, the fact that Peyton Manning came in at an instant success, that stuff I think is going to drive interest from other elite quarterbacks. So that part of it I think is important. The supporting cast is important. I mean, you can be dropped in there and be surrounded by some pretty good talent. And it's interesting when you watch a set of moves like giving Tim Patrick that extension, giving Courtland Sutton that extension. And you think, well, man, they're kind of committing to this version of the roster without a quarterback, and I'm not sure what the future looks like, but it kind of reminds me of the Amari Cooper trade as it relates to the Browns. You want to make yourself an attractive destination, and the Broncos did that with some of those moves. So when you look at so many things in the plus column for Denver, having to play against other good quarterbacks every single week, I don't think is necessarily enough of a drawback to push back on Russell Wilson's interest in landing there.
And I think kind of going off that point, like building that infrastructure, it kind of reminds me of, kind of on Robert's website today, there was a really good story about how the Browns basically got back in the Deshaun Watson conversation. And I'm sure that guaranteeing someone $250 million goes a long way toward that. But I do think, making those trades, there was a scene in that story of Kevin Stefanski just taking an iPad and sitting down with Deshaun for an hour and saying, look, man, like, here's the RPO game you ran in 19 and 20. This is exactly what we're going to do. Look at how good and young our defense is with Owusu Koramoah and Myles Garrett and so on and so forth. I mean, if you can build something that you say, hey, look, we're going to drop you in here. This is what we're going to do, and we have a smart plan in place, and we're going to give you a lot of money. I think that is very attractive to guys like that, especially a guy like Russell who, like let Russ cook is a thing for a reason, right?
They when we were sitting here this time last year, it was Fitzpatrick that the Commanders, then Washington football team picked up, And nationally, after they signed Samuels as well, nationally, people were high on the Washington football team. I know they were coming off the playoff. I mean, I could suggest that the roster is not much worse and that they might have upgraded at the quarterback position. The buzz seems so much less this year. Are you surprised by that, Sam?
No, I think the buzz was built a lot last year on how good people thought this defense was going to be. I mean, by any metric or eye test that you want to go, they were probably a top 5 defense in 2020. And I mean, we know that defense is not linear; it's a little less stable from year to year. So to add William Jackson, who was thought to be a lockdown number 1 corner, to draft Jamin Davis, who at the time, when we're talking about last year, he was seen as like a Mike linebacker. And now we know that that's clearly not the case. So I think a lot of that has to hinges on the defense and how many questions there are about Jack Del Rio's ability to optimize it. So I'm not surprised there's not a lot of buzz. Also, Carson Wentz is damaged goods, 3rd team in 3 years. So I think that there are a lot of questions. There probably should have been more questions about this team last year, I think, than there were. And so maybe we're just seeing a market correction.
I totally agree with Sam. And I think that the defensive part of it is what gives me pause. We saw what they did a couple of years ago. And defense is not sticky from season to season. We know that. It's really hard to maintain excellent defense year in and year out in the NFL. So many things are slanted against you. I did not expect them to go from a very promising young defense to a bottom 5 defense by some metrics. And that gives me a lot of hesitation about how much faith we should put in the coaching staff over there, because they still have a decent amount of talent. So that's something where I need proof the other way before I start to build some enthusiasm about what they have on the defensive side of the ball there.
J.D. McKissick took a U-turn. Sam, there actually were a bunch of U-turns this season. I'm curious. I mean, he obviously just wanted to be in Washington. There's no, which is surprising because I guess I'll build a question off of that question. But I mean, the Bills might have the best roster in the league, right? And he flipped. I'm curious your insights onto that.
Yeah, I think the Bills certainly have one of the best rosters in the league. I can't imagine that playing with Josh Allen is not attractive to any offensive player in the league. But I mean, J.D. McKissick, I think, felt a real attachment to Washington because he had kind of been that gadget guy, a receiver, running back sort of hybrid, in Atlanta, in Seattle, in Detroit. And so he really was able to, I guess, blossom in Washington. And so I think that, a lot of players talk about, hey, I really like this place. I want to be here. And then that ends up not being true, or someone ends up offering more money. But in this case, if the money were equal, JD obviously prioritized being here. He has a really strong relationship with Antonio Gibson, their 3rd round pick from 2020. And he's really, whether it be Connect 4 or just talking trash to defensive players, like he is, I think, a real locker room guy. I certainly was surprised that those relationships would supersede a desire to win, or especially all costs being equal coming back here. But obviously he's built a pretty strong relationship with this coaching staff, with some players in the locker room as well.
Now, it's not exactly what I think I do, but it sounds like they're serious about extending Payne. It feels like a lot of money to pay tackle. You think they're serious about getting something done with him?
Yeah, I would kind of want to see the numbers, I guess, or how far apart Payne's representation in the team is, because I mean, if you're Payne and you don't have some of the numbers that John Allen has, okay, what is your market? Because I'm sure that Payne would love to be up near Kenny Clark money, but okay, are we talking 14, 15, 16 per year? Because I would imagine that they value edge rushers more, and Montez Sweat is obviously coming up a year after that. So if you look at that line, I just can't imagine that you're paying all 4 dudes, especially when you have a top corner and you have some other pieces that you still need, including a middle linebacker. I would be surprised if Payne got what would be seen as a market deal, and they still try to keep Montez Sweat as well. But I think we're probably too early to say. I think they would be comfortable letting Payne play his 5th-year option. But that's my sense of it, is you probably can't keep all 4 guys. And I imagine you're not letting Chase Young go. And I would imagine you'd prioritize Sweat over Payne.
The other one is Terry McLaurin. He's got no reason where it certainly his agent has no reason to sign a new deal before at least the rest of the guys from his draft class resign, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially when you see like Christian Kirk and those dudes get the money that they got. Like, I mean, time is his friend, especially if the receiver market is going to keep going the way it is. So if you're Terry McLaurin and you feel like you now have a quarterback that can make throws to the second or third level consistently for the first time in 2 years, I mean, if this is not Alex Smith, this is not Taylor Heineke, like he's going to give you a chance to go get the ball. And so, I mean, like I definitely would not sign anything right now. It's like, okay, cool. Like Christian Kirk's going to get that money. Like other dudes are going to get that money. Like I'm going to bet on myself this year and we can talk next offseason. But I mean, I'm not the one that someone's coming to me and saying, hey, here's $100+ million. So that's tough.
Robert, were you surprised? I was stunned. I really kind of thought that part of the Davante Adams thing was Rodgers. He spurned them for the Raiders. I guess he said it was for Derek Carr. I find that hard to believe, but he left money on the table and everything. Was I surprising to you?
Yes. I mean, there's no way for us to know what the relationship had gotten to, right? And how much the animus between them not extending him last year and him being on the tag and whether that had frayed to the point where he didn't want to play there anymore. Relationships aside, when you just look at the chessboard and what it looked like and you take into account all the other moves that they made, I mean, it just seemed like with the Rodgers extension, with the way that they were moving the money around, they would get all this done. I mean, they would be willing to do whatever they had to do to get it done. And it sounded like financially, they were willing to stretch themselves as thin as they needed to bring that group back, because once you've committed to Rodgers in that way, you've committed to a lifestyle. I mean, at a certain point, what's another $7 million on the Davante Adams extension? You're going to drive this thing off the financial cliff at some point anyway. So you might as well commit yourself to it. And it sounds like they were, but that's the whole point of this, is that there's no accounting sometimes for how a player feels and what a player wants. And if Davante wants a fresh start, like, listen, then when you get creep toward 30, sometimes you just need a change of scenery, need a new gig, and you want to start over. You want to show you can do it elsewhere. He's got a young family. There's so many different things to take into account here. And that's just something none of us could know. I mean, often you try to look at how a set of moves will inform the next move. And based on what the Packers did, everything that they were doing led you to believe that Davante Adams would be back. But again, there's no understanding how frayed that relationship had become because he didn't appreciate the way that they handled the extension talks over the last 12 months or so.
Sam, I know you got to run, so there's a couple more on the Commanders. You think they'll go? I mean, does Wentz preclude them from taking quarterback at 11?
I mean, I asked that question like with the same verb, preclude, to Ron Rivera, and he said this doesn't preclude us from doing anything. I do think that if they do draft a quarterback at 11, that is certainly undercutting what they told Carson Wentz, which is, that we really want you here. You're our priority. We think you could be the long-term guy. So, knowing that they want to build a strong relationship with Carson early on, that would not be a way to do it. So I'd be surprised if they did. I wouldn't be surprised if they took one in the second, third, fourth round and said, "Hell, this is the Kirk Cousins in the RG3 draft move." But at 11, yeah, I would be.
What if you wanted to show him that he was really the future? Wouldn't you just extend him? Were you surprised that they didn't do anything with that contract? Certainly, they could have gotten more cap relief.
No, because if he sucks this year, they can just cut him and there's no guaranteed money. So I totally understand where they're coming from. It's like, we believe that you're the guy, but we're skeptical, or we have a certain amount of hesitation. If you play well this year, you'll get rewarded. I'm sure that. That just makes a ton of sense to me on both sides. Carson, I can't imagine wants to, necessarily maybe commit to being here, although I'm sure he would love the money as well. But just when I think about that deal, it's like both are damaged goods looking for rebounds, and it makes it kind of a perfect marriage.
And do you think they'll have any interest in either Matthew or Wagner?
I don't know. That's tough. Obviously they do need a Mike linebacker. Ron Rivera talked up especially needing a veteran Mike linebacker. I don't know what those guys would cost. They have some, money left over from the flurry of moves they made at the start of free agency, including cutting Ioannidis and Flowers. They used some of it on Norwell, but 2 years at $10 million is not a huge commitment. So they have some money left over. I would be interested to see what they do, whether it be one of those guys. I'd be curious to the market. I do think that they could look at the draft, maybe even 11. I know the Georgia linebacker and a couple of those guys seem promising. I don't know if you want to do it 2 years in a row after missing on Jamin Davis and say, hey, like, let's go right back at it. But I mean, certainly that is a hole, and they will have to fill it.
I saw Luke Kuechly at the combine. He looked like he was in pretty good shape. I mean, if somebody wants to pick up the phone.
That would be great. I think they
Ron wishes, I'm sure.
That's right. Sam Forte writes for the Washington Post and covers the Commanders. Thank you so much, sir. Robert Mays, who hosts the Athletic Football Show, was on today as well. Robert, thank you so much for your time today.
Appreciate it, guys.
Thanks.
Fellas.